Hello, welcome to Nightmare Survivals. Today we share a survival story with you about a woman named Hannah, and here's her experience. Don't forget to subscribe. Hannah moved into the apartment with a sense of excitement, and it was hers, and that made it special. The apartment was perfect, or at least that's what Hannah kept telling herself. After months of hunting for a place she could afford, this little one-bedroom unit in the heart of downtown felt like a dream. The high ceilings, vintage moldings, and slightly creaky wooden floors all added to its charm. She didn't mind that it came furnished with the remnants of someone else's life: faded rugs, a rickety chair, and a towering mirror leaning against the wall of the bedroom. The mirror, with its ornate gold frame and jagged crack running diagonally across the surface, gave the room an old-world elegance she secretly loved. On her first night, after unpacking the essentials, she stood in front of the mirror to examine her reflection. It made her look different. Something about the way it caught the dim light elongated her silhouette and deepened the shadows under her eyes. She chalked it up to exhaustion and went to bed. Hannah awoke in the middle of the night to an unusual stillness. The city outside was always bustling, even at 3 a.m. But tonight the silence pressed against her ears. Turning over, her gaze fell toward the corner of the room where the mirror stood. In the faint light, its surface seemed to glow ever so slightly. She rubbed her eyes, blaming the illusion on her half-asleep state. But when she looked again, the glow was still there. It wasn't bright, just enough to make the cracked glass shimmer. She pulled the blanket over her head and whispered to herself, "It's just the city lights. Go to sleep." Days passed without incident, but the mirror began to feel like an uninvited guest. Every time she entered the bedroom, it seemed to demand her attention. She'd catch herself glancing at it while changing clothes or brushing her hair, half expecting it to move on its own. One morning, as she was tidying up, she noticed the crack in the mirror had deepened. It seemed longer, snaking almost to the center of the glass. She frowned, running her fingers lightly along the frame, wondering if the vibration from nearby construction had caused it to worsen. That night, Hannah had her first strange dream. She was standing in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. But the reflection didn't move as she did. Instead, it smiled, a slow, wide grin that stretched unnaturally across its face. She woke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. When she turned to look at the mirror in the corner, it was just as she'd left it. There was no smile, no distortion, just her reflection staring back at her. But sleep didn't come easily after that. The next day, Hannah noticed something peculiar. The mirror, which she hadn't touched since moving in, was spotless. No dust, no smudges, not even fingerprints. She tilted her head, trying to remember if she'd wiped it down while unpacking. She was almost certain she hadn't. That evening, Hannah sat in bed scrolling through her phone when she caught movement in her peripheral vision. She looked up startled, but saw nothing unusual. Shaking her head, she laughed nervously. "You're spooking yourself," she muttered, turning back to her phone. Moments later, it happened again, a flicker of shadow in the mirror surface. This time, she froze, her breath hitching in her throat. Slowly, she turned her head to face the glass, her eyes scanning its reflection. The bedroom looked just as it should, with the lamp casting a warm glow across the walls. But there in the corner of the mirror, she swore she saw it, a fleeting shape, darker than a shadow, slipping out of sight. She climbed out of bed and approached the mirror cautiously, her heart pounding louder with each step. The reflection stared back at her, perfectly normal. Too normal. It felt like the room in the glass was trying too hard to convince her it was just a reflection. Hannah decided to ignore the mirror for the next few days, throwing a blanket over it to keep herself from glancing at it. But the unease lingered, growing stronger with each passing night. A week later, while brushing her hair before bed, she decided to remove the blanket. Standing in front of the mirror, she avoided looking directly at her reflection. But something compelled her to glance up, and when she did, her blood ran cold. Her reflection was smiling at her. It wasn't a kind smile. It was wide, stretched unnaturally across her face, her lips curling into a grin that no human face could hold. Her own face remained expressionless, frozen in horror. She stumbled backward, knocking the hairbrush from her hand. When she dared to look again, the reflection was normal. Trembling, she fled the room. That night, Hannah struggled to sleep. Her ears strained against the silence, picking up faint, unintelligible whispers. At first, she thought it was her neighbors or a radio playing somewhere in the building. But as the hours ticked by, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. The sound seemed to come from her bedroom, specifically from the mirror. Gathering her courage, she crept into the room with her phone's flashlight. The whispers stopped the moment the light hit the mirror, leaving only her pale reflection staring back. She turned off the flashlight and climbed back into bed, vowing to call the landlord in the morning. Just as she was drifting off, a loud thud jolted her awake. The sound had come from her bedroom. Heart racing, she tiptoed to the door and peered inside. The blanket she'd thrown over the mirror was crumpled on the floor as though someone or something had ripped it off. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder this time, joined by a low, guttural laugh. Hannah screamed and grabbed her phone, shining the flashlight directly at the mirror. The surface rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. A skeletal hand pressed against the glass from the other side, its long, bony fingers clawing at the surface. Frozen in terror, Hannah watched as the hand pushed harder, cracks spreading like spiderwebs across the glass. She grabbed a heavy book from the nightstand and hurled it at the mirror with all her strength. The glass shattered, shards flying in every direction. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Hannah backed out of the room, too afraid to look at the broken pieces scattered on the floor. The next morning, she called the landlord and demanded answers. His voice was tense as he admitted that the mirror had belonged to the previous tenant. They said it was cursed, he explained hesitantly. I didn't believe them until now. The landlord sent someone to remove the shards that afternoon, but even as they were taken away, Hannah felt the weight of the mirror's presence lingering in the apartment. Over the next few weeks, strange occurrences continued. Shadows flickered at the edge of her vision, and whispers crept into her ears at night. Unable to take it anymore, she moved out, leaving the apartment and its horrors behind. But even in her new home, in the quietest hours of the night, she sometimes hears soft, mocking laughter echoing from the darkness. Hannah moved into her new apartment with hope in her heart, determined to leave the horrors of the haunted mirror behind her. The new space was modern, brightly lit, and free from any remnants of the past. She deliberately avoided having mirrors, tossing out every reflective surface she owned except for a small, compact mirror she kept buried in her purse. For a time, the quiet of her new surroundings gave her a fragile sense of peace. But even in this new haven, the unease began to creep back into her life. It started subtly, with faint noises in the night, soft scratching sounds against the walls, and occasional whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. At first, she dismissed them as the creaks and groans of an old building or the muffled sounds of neighbors. Yet, as the nights passed, those whispers grew louder, forming unintelligible words and laughter that seemed eerily familiar. One evening, as she sat in her living room trying to read, a flicker of movement caught her eye. She glanced toward the window overlooking the alley and froze. Standing outside, just beyond the glass, was a figure tall and impossibly thin. Its shadowy form was unnaturally still, as though carved from the darkness itself. She blinked, and it was gone. shaking her head. She convinced herself it was her imagination playing tricks on her. That night, she was woken by the sound of footsteps. They were soft at first, a steady pacing in the living room. Her heart thudded in her chest as she lay still, listening intently. The sound grew louder, moving closer to her bedroom door. Hannah reached for her phone, intending to call for help, but the screen remained unresponsive, its light flickering before shutting off completely. A cold draft swept through the room, and she watched in terror as the handle of her bedroom door jiggled lightly, as if tested by an unseen hand. The next morning, Hannah tried to shake the fear. She splashed cold water on her face in the bathroom and glanced up at the small mirror above the sink. Her reflection stared back, but something about it wasn't right. The face in the mirror seemed unnervingly still, and then it smiled, a slow, crooked grin that sent a chill down her spine. Gasping, she yanked a towel over the mirror and fled the room, vowing to remove it entirely. By the end of the day, she could no longer ignore the signs, the whispers, the figure in the alley, and now the chilling behavior of her reflection. It was all connected. Desperate for answers, she began digging into the history of the mirror she had left behind. She called her former landlord, who admitted that the mirror had an unsettling history. It had been left in the apartment by a tenant decades ago and was rumored to be cursed. Many who stayed in the unit reported strange happenings before abandoning the space without explanation. Her investigation led her to a dusty old antique shop downtown. The shopkeeper, a weary-looking man with deep-set eyes, confirmed her fears. The mirror had once been part of a seance performed over a century ago, meant to connect with the spirit world. Something had gone terribly wrong, and the mirror had become a gateway for a dark and malevolent entity. "You should never have taken it into your home," he warned. Determined to end the nightmare, Hannah armed herself with an ancient ritual from a book the shopkeeper reluctantly provided. The instructions were clear. She needed items that would sever the connection, including shards of the mirror. With dread, she returned to her old apartment, hoping to retrieve the pieces of the shattered glass. The landlord allowed her in briefly, but the air in the apartment felt heavier, colder, and filled with a presence that made her skin crawl. She found the shards packed away in a box, their edges gleaming as if they pulsed with life. Back in her new apartment, she prepared the ritual. The shards were arranged in a circle surrounded by a ring of salt, and candles flickered in the dim light as she began to chant the incantation. The whispers erupted into deafening screams, and shadows writhed around her, clawing at the edges of the salt barrier. The largest shard of glass began to ripple, and from within, her reflection emerged, twisted and grotesque. It wore her face, but its grin stretched impossibly wide, and its eyes burned with a malevolent glow. The entity lunged at her, but the salt circle held it back. Hannah's voice trembled as she forced herself to continue the incantation, her words rising above the chaos. The room grew colder, the air thick with tension, and then, with a blinding flash of light, the shards shattered into dust. The shadows screamed and dissolved, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Exhausted and trembling, Hannah collected the remnants of the shards and buried them in a remote forest far from the city. For weeks, she lived in relative peace, finally free of the nightmare that had consumed her life. But one day, as she walked past a shop window, she glanced at her reflection and froze. For just a moment, the figure in the glass lingered longer than it should have after she turned away. It wasn't smiling this time, but she swore its lips began to curl as she hurried past.